Tarnowieckyi is a professor of history here at Weatherford College and is the chair of the social sciences department. He got his bachelor's in secondary education with social studies emphasis from Missouri Southern State University. He has an MA in history from Pittsburgh State University and a PhD in history from the University of Arkansas. Prior to teaching at Weatherford College, Dr. Tarnowieckyi, more commonly known as Dr. T, to his students has had a wide array of teaching experiences. He wrote this. He was a master lecturer at the University of Arkansas and later a visiting assistant professor there. He was adjunct instructor at Northwest Arkansas Community College, adjunct instructor and also a visiting assistant professor at Missouri Southern State University, visiting assistant professor at Arkansas Tech University, and visiting assistant professor at Texas A&M University in College Station. He also worked on the Arkansas Oral History Project and was an editorial assistant for the academic journal Arkansas Historical Quarterly. He has presented at numerous historical conferences and written several book reviews for such journals as the Pacific Northwest Quarterly, Southern Historian, Military History of the West, Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, Louisiana History, and the Journal of Southern History. He has also been published in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society and has a chapter in the book Border Wars, the Civil War in Tennessee and Kentucky, published in 2015 by Kent State University Press. And I will leave it to him for Gettysburg and the Lost Cause.
I thought that was a pretty good introduction, so I'm done. All right, well, thanks to all of you for coming to the presentation, coming to the conference. It's really nice. I know how unpleasantly cold it was starting this morning, and I think it still is. I've been in this building for a little while, so I assume it's cold. It's chilly. I was the one who actually wrote that. That was very nice of you to read it for me.
Very well.
In fact, a lot of those things when he read, I was like, oh yeah, did I do that? It was so long ago that my memory's starting to fade. And actually, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Not my memory, but memory, historical reality versus historical memory. And we all deal with this. For example, what was it, last night? I was feeding my daughter, and I was holding her, and I had this bottle. And my wife says to me, she goes, "Is that the milk from the refrigerator?" And I said, "No, there wasn't any milk in the refrigerator." And so we got into an argument on whether or not there was a bottle of milk in the refrigerator. And so I had to go, and I knew it. The historical reality was, there's a bottle in that refrigerator. But to prove myself right, I went there. There was a bottle in it. So that was historical memory, but not historical reality.
You're on the sofa tonight, buddy.
Yes. All right. So what this presentation is all about is I'm looking at two things, trying to combine this. It's kind of an intellectual approach, intellectual history, which is trying to examine Lost Cause Mythology through the lens of Gettysburg, trying to Battle of Gettysburg. And why do we remember Gettysburg? I mean, really, think about it. First of all, let's just jump to this particular slide here. When I looked last night, I was creating this PowerPoint last night because I'm prepared. And so I typed in to Amazon, and I said, Gettysburg. I got over 6,000 books on Amazon. Okay, so first of all, the American Civil War is the most popular topic. Come on in. Is the most popular. This is the most popular topic in American history. There's like over 50,000 books. Come on in. And not only are there over 50,000 books, then you got over 6,000 of them. That's a pretty heavy percentage on a battle. The battle or campaign of Gettysburg. So obviously in our psyche, in the American mind, we like Gettysburg. We think it's pretty darn important, right? For some reason. And there's endless books and everything. Of course, this book right here, The Gettysburg Campaign, A Study in Command by Coddington in 1968, is still considered the book. If you want the most exhaustive, detailed book on Gettysburg Campaign, this is it. And then there's just endless. I just put some out. High Tide at Gettysburg. Gettysburg the first day. And then you went with Gettysburg the second day. And there's a third day to the battle, but the publishers apparently didn't like that. So they said Gettysburg, Cults Hill, and Cemetery Hill. The publisher get to pick the textbook, or the names of the books. Gettysburg, A Journey in Time. When I saw that, I was like, is that about Harry Turtledove? And is he going back into... No, it's actually a book about pictures on Gettysburg. Just pictures. Let's talk about pictures of Gettysburg. Carol Reardon, who's kind of like a big name on Gettysburg. Pickett's Charge in History and Memory. How we remember Gettysburg. Pickett's Charge, The Last Attack at Gettysburg. Gettysburg Heroes. This one I've read, actually, and it's all about memorials. So if you're really into wanting to know the formulation of memorials on Gettysburg, this is your book. Retreat from Gettysburg. If we're going to retreat, we got to get there too. So Jeb Stuart's Ride to Gettysburg, or Ride Around to Gettysburg. And there's even, of course, because if you're talking about Gettysburg, the spirits of Gettysburg. Have you ever been to Gettysburg? Did the ghost tours?
No.
Oh, it's about ghosts. This is about the ghosts of
She
Gettysburg.
led mine.
What's that?
Carol Reardon led mine.
Oh my gosh, you got that?
Yeah.
You are.
because I was a grad student at Penn
Oh,
State.
you are
She
so
teaches at Penn
lucky.
State,
Yeah.
so yes. She led my
That's
tour of
pretty- that's
Gettysburg.
pretty neat. And it just goes on. And, you could probably type in, the latrines of Gettysburg. Someone's written something about where they potty. So there's endless amounts of books on Gettysburg. So obviously, again, we think it's pretty darn important. Oh, and by the way, one time I read a book. I didn't put it up here because I'm going to trash it. I didn't want you to know the title of the book. But this book, oh, well, Lord, this is one of those books. Those of you who like history, do you have friends who give you birthday presents of 101 trivial facts about history, and you have no interest in those books? And you're never going to read them? But they think, oh, well, you would love meaningless. Okay, well, this book, and that's not up here. This particular book is each chapter was exploring a mystery. And at the end of each chapter, the writer would say, and the fog is lifted. If you're going to write a book, don't do that. Don't end a chapters, the fog is lifted. That's a horrible thing to say. Just don't do the fog is lifted. Try something a little better. Now, if I were to poll the students, and I could probably do that in this hallway, but if I went and polled 100 students and I said, what battle do you remember above all other battles of the Civil War? Most of them would say Pearl Harbor. But the ones that actually got a Civil War battle would say Gettysburg for sure, right? And if I said, okay, tell me a participant, a general or someone who fought in the Civil War, they would say Abraham Lincoln because he wasn't there, because they know about the Gettysburg Address. But once I got past Lincoln, who do you think they would say? And you cannot use the fact that some of you read The Killer Angels or watched Gettysburg. Okay, we all like Joshua Chamberlain, but come on. Robert E. Lee. We all remember Lee, right? And if you don't remember Lee, they probably say what?
Grant.
Pick it, right? So more often than not, if I polled students and I say, well, who do you remember that was there? They would almost certainly say, oh, Robert E. Lee, George Pickett, okay, the guy who did Pickett's Charge. Now, guess who they wouldn't say? I can guarantee you, well, I can't guarantee you, but I'm pretty sure no one would say George Gordon Meade. Who did what? Commanded the Army of the Potomac and won the battle. He wasn't on the losing side that had to run away. He's the guy that won. But we don't remember Meade. None of us remember Joshua Chamberlain until you happen to bother to read the Killer Angels. It's an excellent book, by the way. It's a fiction, book of fiction, but a great book. So we don't, why we kind of remember the who side. The Confederates, the Southern side. That's interesting. We tend to remember Lee, and if we remember Lee, who else do we remember?
Jackson.
Old Stonewall, right? Old Stonewall Jackson, buried in one place, his arms buried in another place in Virginia. I'm not making that up; it's true. So I poll people, I'm gonna get Gettysburg as the one they remember. And if I poll people and say, who are you going to remember from this, they would almost certainly say Lee, Pickett. Those are probably two famous names that come out of this. And this is all tied into what's called Lost Cause Mythology. And by the way, the Lost Cause, that phrase actually comes from a book. Come on in. That phrase actually comes from a book by a writer who was from Richmond, Virginia, back in that time. And he wrote a book called The Lost Cause, and that's where we get this phrase, Lost Cause Mythology. Now, what is the Lost Cause? Lost Cause Mythology, let's put it this way. The first thing is, I think that we got to first of all remember is that the Confederacy lost, right? Hopefully most of us know that. So the Confederates lost the Civil War. And they lost bad. I mean, not like, no. They lost everything. I mean, first of all, the Southern society was predicated upon what economic institution? Slavery. That's gone. Half of their entire wealth was in enslaved people. That's gone. So their economy is absolutely shattered in every way imaginable as a result of their failure in the Civil War. Their infrastructure is completely destroyed. Their will is absolutely crushed by 1865. A lot of times people go like, oh, what do you mean? Look at the desertion rates of the Confederate armies by 1865. It's massive. They're all going home. They're like, Sherman's marching everywhere. Why should I stay here? Mom or my wife is saying, come home. What are you going to fight and die for? And you lost. Come home. So desertion rates were high. They knew they were done. And so there's a social system is destroyed. Not only that, somewhere around, I don't remember the exact percentage, but somewhere between 20 to 25% of the entire white male Southern population between 20 to 40 is dead by 1860. It's wiped out. Huge losses, and that doesn't count all the people that are missing legs and arms and all sorts of problems, and not to mention the PTSD that they most certainly were going to suffer from. So it was a defeat, an absolute crushing, conquested, that's not really defeat. So the thing is this, who led the South into this? Who's responsible for this? Well, it's the Southern leaders, right? The planter class who led the South into secession and duped everyone else, quite honestly, into it. And led them into civil war, and then were in charge. They were the government leaders. They were the guys in charge of the institutions, and they failed. They lost. They are responsible for getting into the war and losing the war. And also the generals are responsible. The Confederate generals lost those battles. Their armies were defeated. It wasn't like they were like, let's let the Union win. They were defeated. Ultimately, they were defeated. So these people, this group of leaders, military and political leaders, as the war comes to an end, in the years that follow, they don't really want to accept responsibility for this. They're looking for a way to say, oh no, it wasn't us. Or, no, we didn't really lose. Or, no, it wasn't about that, it was about... They create a false historical narrative that becomes the lost cause. And later on becomes referred to as Lost Cause Mythology. So let me kind of break it down some of that. I'm not going to talk all about Lost Cause Mythology. I'm not going to talk about Reconstruction. That's not really part of this topic. But one of the things that's very well known, and the thing is, I should say, Lost Cause Mythology pervades American society. For example, in American history textbooks in Texas, you have to have it. It's mandated by the state, although I think they kind of just changed it. That you have to talk about not only that slavery was a cause of the war, but also what? States' rights and cultural differences, right? Despite the fact historians know that those two, last two, that wasn't real. That's not the cause. That's made up stuff after the fact by the losers, the people who were justifying defeat. So Lost Cause Mythology includes why the war was fought, why it happened, the causes. Now, historians understand it was slavery. All you got to do is look at the crisis events from the Wilmot Proviso in 1845 or so, all the way to the election of 1860, and every crisis event that was a big deal in that time related to what? Slavery. If you want to know more about that, take my U.S. History 1 class, I'll tell you all about it. But I'm not giving away that stuff for free. You got to pay $240. All right, so it's about slavery. But these people after the Civil War say, oh, no, it wasn't about slavery. But the thing is this, we actually have their speeches. We have their letters. We know what they said. We know what they believed going into this. And they said, universally, it's about slavery. We're doing this to protect the institution of slavery. We are not going to tolerate a Republican president who is an abolitionist as far as they were concerned and going to unleash a bunch of John Brown rebellions against us. We're going to prevent that before it happens. That's what they're thinking. And then all you really have to do, if you really don't believe them, read their secession convention, why they seceded. You can use your phones. Type up Texas State Secession Convention. Realize the number of times they talk about slavery. If you really want to know, read South Carolina. Oh my gosh. They're pretty much like slavery is it, we're out. You know, Negroes are lesser races, white races, superior race, blah, 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 blah. I mean, they're going to say a little bit about states' rights, but it's about slavery, and it's very clear they're doing this for slavery. So they create a fictional history that says, we are doing this not for slavery. Who would fight for the immoral institution of slavery? It was for our honor and our states' rights. States' rights, what right? What right is being threatened? Oh, it was tariffs. What tariff? Give me the exact tariff you're talking about. Tariff of 1832? You mean 20 years before the Civil War? That tariff that no longer was in effect? Oh, you get tariff. Okay, so you can't give me a specific tariff. And it's odd that in all those secession conventions, apparently they were embarrassed by the fact they were going to secede for about tariffs. So mainly they said, well, we want to hide that, but let's just talk about slavery. They won't have to ever good. No, we're really talking about tariffs. It's a code. It's a code. They're talking about slavery. And there's also this cultural difference. Well, the South is culturally different from the industrialized, urbanized North. Guess what most Northerners were still by 1860? Farmers. They were rural Americans. But why is the South is not industrializing at all and remaining very, very rural and agrarian? Because the people who had the money to invest in something other than farming were the planters. And guess what they would rather reinvest their money in? More land and more slaves, because they know they can make money off that. 10% profit pretty much guaranteed year after year. Why mess it up? So the South remains rural and agrarian for what reason? Slavery. The money comes from slavery. So it's about slavery. Even when they try to give us different arguments, it's still about slavery. The cultural difference that you claim is a cultural difference is predicated upon slavery. So causes of the war is a false narrative, and they buy into it hard. And partly the reason why they buy into this hard is even before the Civil War happened, most Southern slave owners thought slavery was kind of wrong. They didn't say it, but they knew it. And all you got to do is read the letters about when they refer, I don't know if you've done this, when they refer to in their diaries or their journals or whatever about their slaves, guess what they never call their slaves? Slaves. They always call them one of two things. My servants, as if they're employees, or my Negroes. That's what they say every time. They never refer to their own slaves as slaves. Why would they perhaps not be comfortable doing that? Maybe deep down inside they kind of knew what? It was wrong. Owning and enslaving another human being is wrong. And they were uncomfortable with it. And after the Civil War, for the most part, most Southerners kind of embraced the idea that, you know what, that slavery was wrong. So let's say you're a political leader who led the South in the Civil War. Are you then going to say, yeah, so I led us all into ultimate destruction so that to preserve an institution that we all knew was immoral? Yes. Is that going to get you reelected? So they come up with stuff. They're making things up. They're deflecting from the actual causes. And most Southerners are very comfortable with that. Because do most Southerners really want to embrace the idea that they really were fighting, whether or not they were directly fighting, but that ultimately the war was about preserving slavery? I really don't want to talk about that. Well, what are we going to talk about? States' rights. What rights? What states' rights? It's just a circular argument. States' rights, tariffs, states' rights, tariffs. That's what they do. So the causes are the Lost Cause Mythology about the causes. Then there's this is probably my favorite. In the Lost Cause Mythology, the South didn't lose the Civil War. They didn't. Because, this is the argument, because they knew when the war broke out, the claim was, that guess what they couldn't do? They couldn't win. They knew it. They knew. We never stood a chance of actually winning. We were fighting for our honor. Okay, the honor, they always go. We had to fight for our honor. And the thing is, if you go back and read what they wrote in 1860, 61, 60, they're like, one Johnny Reb is worth 10 Yankees. We can easily beat these city boys. They absolutely were convinced they were going to win. And so now all of a sudden afterwards, you're claiming you couldn't win and you knew it all along. And why couldn't they win? Well, the North had what? Huge industrial advantage, huge manpower advantage, and therefore we never could win. That's the argument. Despite the fact that they didn't say that until after the war was over. Before, we're going to win. So, if you knew going in you can't win, guess what? You can't lose. So it was. We didn't really lose. We knew we were going to lose to begin with. So what? It's not a loss. You ever done that? I remember growing up. My freshman year of college, my high school football team had a really good football team. We were going to state again, gonna take on that St. Louis Sumner and revenge our defeat from the year before. But semifinals, the football team goes up to St. Joseph, Missouri, and that night it snows and turns the field into mud. And unfortunately for the Webb City Cardinals, the St. Joseph, whoever they were, ran an I offense where they just run straight up the middle. Whereas Webb City ran a split back veer off. It's an option. So all predicated on speed and getting around the edge. Guess what you can't do in 6 inches of mud? That. So guess who won? St. Joseph, whatever did. But dang it, they didn't win. It was the mud that won. I still believe that. Back in 1992, and I'm still remembering, that dang mud. The other team didn't beat us, it was the mud. We all do that, right? We all create these fictional things of why we lost, but it really wasn't a loss. The belt was too tight, the sun was in my eyes, whatever. So, the fact is one, they knew, they believed they were going to win going into the war. And not only that, you got to think about the realities of what the North is facing. The states that secede from the Union, that's a big area. The North is going to have to march down there. They have to build a big armies, march south, and conquer it. That's not easy. That's a daunting task. The Confederacy had a real... I'm not saying that the Confederacy was doomed to win, or destined to win, and I think it would have been very difficult for them to win. But it's not as though there was just no advantages. There was, to a certain degree, certain things were kind of evening out. Plus, who gets to fight on the defensive in these battles more often than not? The Confederacy does, and based upon the weaponry of the day in a battle, guess who has the advantage? The defenders do. It's much harder to coordinate an effective attacks upon an enemy that's ready to go with cannons that can fire canister shot 300 yards out, which is a canister shot is basically a coffee can made of paper mache with 100 bullets in it, which means you, the Union soldier, has to cross open fields where these guys are unloading 3 of those on you, shots at you a minute. Then you get within about 100 yards of the infantry, and they start firing at you, and they can reload 6 times a minute. That gives the defender a pretty big advantage. Okay, so the Confederacy did have advantages. But, so quite honestly, the Confederacy, the Lost Cause argument of the South was destined to lose, therefore we didn't lose, is a bunch of bullpooping. It's justifying loss. It's saying, well, there was no way for us to lose, so therefore we couldn't lose. Another aspect of this whole lost cause mythology is, and this is where we get to all of this. There is an extraordinary focus on Lee and in Virginia, the Eastern Theater, what's going on there. Overwhelmingly, the books that were written on the Civil War from roughly the 1860s to the 1960s were overwhelmingly on Lee and the battles between the Army of Northern Virginia and the Battle and Army of the Potomac. In fact, the first serious academic study on the major Confederate Army in the Western Theater, the Army of Tennessee, was written by a guy named Thomas Conley. The first book of the two-volume series came out in like 1968, and the second was 1971. That's how long it takes to write a book on that army. That's sort of odd. So there's this overwhelming focus on Lee. We all do know these guys are the losers, right? Normally when you focus on a war, you tend to focus on the winners and why they won, rather than the guys who, this is, we're in the South, this isn't just Robert E. Lee. This is essentially Saint Lee, right? He becomes this perfect man. Never did anything wrong. Didn't own slaves, he did. He wasn't racist, he was. I mean, he's a Southerner, for goodness sake. He was a white American at that time. Racist. But we have this focus. Why did they focus so much? Where did the Confederacy win? For at least a couple of years. There. Why in Lost Cause mythology there's this huge desire to avoid thinking about all of this, the Western Theater. Well, guess what happens over here? Guess who wins again and again? Name me a major Confederate victory over here outside of Chickamauga. Exactly. Name me a major Confederate victories over here. Oh, Chancellorsville, Second Manassas. We're not going to say First Manassas because that was just like a bunch of guys who ran into one another and one might run the other way. I mean, all sorts of victories here. So the Lost Cause mythologists, the people who create the Lost Cause, which include Edward Pollard and General Jubal Early, who loved Lee. He deified Lee. He was the greatest guy ever. There is an emphasis, a focus upon exclusively focusing on the Virginia theater or the Eastern theater because that's where there were victories. That's where something could be proud of, right? No, we didn't lose it in war. It was just Sherman. He was mean. They actively ignore the West, which for most Civil War historians argue that's where the Union won. Not so much in Virginia, but if you look at this particular map, Union advance, Union advance, Union advance, Union advance. But when the Confederacy kind of starts surrendering in April, this is Sherman's army. He's gone from here down to here, over to here. He had a lot of fun in South Carolina, by the way. He really was mean. South Carolinians. Union troops were a little angry. And Lee's up here. That's it. That's all they had basically left. The area between Richmond and Raleigh. I'd probably go home too at that point. I'm like, we're done. But we focus on Lee because that's. And by the way, what happened to Lee after Gettysburg? Did he win any more battles? Not really. Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna River, Petersburg. He didn't necessarily lose them, but the end result is Grant attacks him and then tries to slip around his flank and try to put himself behind Lee's supply lines and force Lee to come out from behind the entrenchments and attack. And Lee was like, oh, no, I know what you're doing. So it was just kind of this dance. All right, so he hasn't really won, he hasn't really lost until ultimately Petersburg. But in Lost Cause mythology, Grant is a butcher. Grant that butcher, just throwing Union soldiers. Grant is not any good. He just has the numbers. So he just overwhelms Lee with numbers. That's not remotely true. Grant was actually a pretty good general. If any of you have ever studied his efforts to capture Vicksburg, at one point, Grant, trying to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi, literally takes his army, lands it on the Mississippi side of the Mississippi River, which is weird, cuts loose from his supply lines. This is like the first Civil War general to do this. Sherman figures out to do this. And surprises, he does this brilliant campaign to drive the Confederate army into the entrenchments of Vicksburg, and then besiege them, and then it's game over. Grant's a pretty good general. After that, he comes over here and whoops up on Braxton Bragg and Chattanooga in 1864. And it's after that that Lee's like, this guy's a winner. So Lincoln brings, Lincoln brings Grant to take over all the Union armies, and in particular to kind of ramrod in the Army of the Potomac from that point forward. And then Grant's thing is, all right, I'm going to just keep on trying to maneuver my way around Lee to get onto his supply lines, the logistical line. But apparently that's just a brute conqueror just throwing men at you. And not to say that Grant didn't screw up. I mean, if you even know anything about Cold Harbor, he screwed up. But he was not necessarily, but the thing is, if you're trying to focus on how great Lee is, ultimately Lee is what? What happens to Lee when he faces Grant? He's beaten. Well, I thought Lee was this perfect general that couldn't be defeated. Oh, well, he wasn't defeated. He was simply overwhelmed with numbers by that butcher Grant. In other words, St. Lee, really, is he ever beaten? No, Grant just uses overpowering numbers. And that's just not the time. So, do you see how they're creating these arguments? It's a false narrative. It's a historical memory that wasn't real. But Southerners love it. They buy into it hard. And one of the favorite parts of Lost Cause Mythology, and this comes back to Gettysburg, is this. Ignore our puzzled college student. And I literally typed in puzzled college student. That's what came out. So, all right, I'll do that. It said it could be like a copyright. I was like, I don't think anyone's really going to sue me. Anyway, so Gettysburg. How many of you have ever read anything on Gettysburg? All right. Ever saw phrases like the Confederate high tide, the turning point of the war? So obviously, according to this myth, the story, Gettysburg is where it all shifts. Up to that point in time, the Confederacy was winning until Lee lost at Gettysburg, right? Wait a second. I thought the Confederates couldn't win. If they couldn't win, there's no turning point. It was already, what? Is there a logical problem here? There is, because you can't say, well, we're destined to lose, and then say, well, we would have won until Gettysburg. What? That doesn't make sense. So, and is Gettysburg this turning point? No. Historians today, in about the last 50 years, believe what victory was the turning point of the war. It's in Mississippi, you already talked about it. Vicksburg, where Grant cut the Confederacy in half by capturing Vicksburg, splits the Confederacy in half. Grant will then follow that up with his victory at Chattanooga, which propels him to the leadership role. And his buddy Sherman takes charge in the West and goes down to Atlanta and then has fun in southern Georgia. And so that's the beginning of the end. But why do we focus so much on, why do we say this? I was looking up books. I have, any of you have that Time Life series of the Civil War? It's great, it's a really good thing. The book, this is written in the 1980s. The book on Gettysburg, it's called Gettysburg, The Confederate High Tide, in the 1980s. In fact, any of you ever read the Bruce Catton's American Heritage Golden Book of the Civil War? That was my first book on Civil War. The chapter on Gettysburg, Confederate High Tide. That's how pervasive this is, this Lost Cause Mythology, that books that are written pretty recently still use that phrase, even though we know it wasn't the Confederate high tide. Just 5 minutes. All right, I can wrap this up. So what happens is this. Let's consider what's going on here. Lee marches north into Pennsylvania, gets into a battle in a no-name, strategically unimportant location, unless you really want some shoes at the shoe factory at Gettysburg, and loses. So according to the mythology, that was the strategic defeat that doomed the Confederacy. How? How is a defeat up here losing the war down here? It's not like his army was destroyed. He took massive casualties, but so did the Union Army. 50,000 casualties, if you don't know, the two sides combined. He marches south. He lives to fight another day. This is July of 1863. The war doesn't end until April of 1865. How could that be the strategic victory that turns the tide? It can't be, because it wasn't necessarily a strategic victory. He's on a raid. He's raiding into Pennsylvania. He's hoping he might be able to inflict another Fredericksburg upon the Union. But that's it. He's not going to convince the French and the British to change their tune on the war. They're not going to get involved because the war is about slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation made it a war upon slavery, clearly. So what happens is the focus is on this idea of the East, of Virginia. That's where it is. Well, that's just not where they lost. They lost in Vicksburg. They lost in Chattanooga. They lost Atlanta. Sherman was able to march at will through Georgia and the Carolinas, and the Confederates couldn't do anything about it. That's how you win. You crush their armies to the point they can't resist you, and then you march through their territory, doing whatever you want to them, and guess what that does to the will of the people? They go, we're done. We're cooked. It's over. You know, if Sherman can spread out his army for 60 miles wide without having to worry about being attacked, and just destroy everything, all the way to Savannah, Georgia, and then through South Carolina, you might kind of go like, we're kind of lost. We're done. You don't do it at Gettysburg. Now, I'm not saying that Gettysburg's not important. Lee lost a lot of very good aggressive generals at Gettysburg. He never recovers from that. In the battles that he has to fight against, he fights against Grant, Lee is he cannot rely on his generals so effectively that oftentimes he is taking command of divisions and brigades at times, telling them what to do. He has to micromanage because he just doesn't have a particularly good cadre of new generals coming up. They're just not ready. They're not there yet. What we know is this. The Lost Cause mythology was a pervasive mythology that dominates until about the 1960s. Then historians begin to realize that, you know what, this isn't the way it really was. And this is embraced by the North, too. The North starts buying into this, because if you tell a lie enough times, people will start believing the lie. And so but this still we still deal with this today, and don't get all cranky about me, but the whole issues about the Confederate battle flag and where it should be flown, and memorials and statues that we're dealing with, and renaming buildings, this is all related to Lost Cause mythology. Okay? So the decision, what happens back in the 1860s and 1870s to create a false narrative is a narrative that we still deal with to this day. So I hope you understand now that I have lifted the fog. Oh, I used it. The fog is lifted. All right, sir. All right, good, because I'm dry mouth. Is anyone else dry mouth in here? Oh my gosh. Yes, ma'am. If it's about mammoth, I don't know. I do not know if I.
Moving forward, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so when we go to Gettysburg, we look at it more like it was the surrendering time, not that they were winning up to that point. Do you come across that anywhere where that's just where it just, you know,
No.
it's always just they were winning up to that point?
No, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by winning up to that point. They had a string of victories. This is what led Lee to doing what he does. So he wins in what's called the Peninsula Campaign, or the 7 Days Campaign in the summer of 1862. He marches north, wins in the summer of 1862 at Second Manassas, really has a big victory there. Loses at Antietam. Then he wins at Fredericksburg at the turn of 1862-63. There was just an embarrassing victory or defeat for the Union, but nevertheless, we did get the Ambrose Burnsides out of it, so there you go. So everybody wears Burnside Burns. mimicking Ambrose Bierce. Then he wins this incredible, miraculous victory at Chancellorsville that Lee shouldn't have won. So Lee has the initiative. He has to do something. He doesn't want to simply wait for the Union Army to come again at him, because he might not win. He's gotten lucky. Not to mention, maybe if he wins here somehow, if he goes north, maybe it might pull troops out of Vicksburg. Maybe Grant might have to lift the siege. And not to mention, there are people saying that Lee should actually give up some of his troops and send them out west. And he doesn't want to do that. So he says, I'm going to go do something with it. So he raids north, hoping to maneuver the Union Army into a situation where they have to attack him again, like at Fredericksburg. That's his goal, we think. There's a lot of debate on that, but that's almost certainly what he was wanting to do. And it just doesn't work out, mainly because Jeb Stuart, old Jeb Stuart, decides to essentially abandon Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Jeb Stuart's the cavalry commander. The cavalry are the scouts. So Lee is marching blind, not realizing that his cavalry command has just decided on its own to ride around the Army of the Potomac for fun, for glory. And so Lee just assumes that because he's not hearing anything from Jeb Stuart, that means there's nothing to be reported. And the problem is Jeb Stuart is feverishly trying to get around this Army of the Potomac, which for the first time is actually marching fast. They march slow in Virginia, but oh, you come north, oh, we can march. And they're moving north, and Jeb Stuart's like, I can't get around him. I can't. Lee is blind. And so Lee, as well as the Union armies, stumble into one another at Gettysburg. It just happens to be a place where roads meet. It's a good place to concentrate your armies, because Lee's army was strung out over 60 miles. And when Lee starts to realize the Union army is potentially approaching, and he's like, where's Jeb Stuart? He should have told me. And at that point, he realizes he's blind. He starts concentrating, and they start bumping into one another and leaving Gettysburg. What happens after this is really Grant. Grant changes the game. Because whereas most generals would fight a battle, win or lose, let's say they lost, let's say the Union Army lost, they would stop, pull back, and wait a few months to rebuild, recover, and then do it again the next season. Grant's like, we're not going to do that. We're going to hit, and if I can't get him here, I'm going to try to maneuver around him and try to get onto his logistical supply line, forcing him to attack me. Basically get on the railroad line to Richmond. That's his plan. And he never can until he gets to Petersburg. And then he besieges Lee at Petersburg over the course of several months, stretching Lee's lines out to the point that he can't. And then just breaks him. And that's it. Okay, yes, sir.
Does this Lost
I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Does the Lost Cause mythology, do they start spreading that immediately after the war?
Pretty quickly. Well, Pollard in particular, his book, I want to say it comes out like in '66 or something like that. It comes out really quick. Jubal Early in particular starts really hitting it pretty hard. And that's when the veneration of Lee really gets going as well. And that's why Longstreet becomes a bad guy in Confederate history, in the Lost Cause Mythology. Because Longstreet was the only general who actually kind of criticized Lee. That's because he worked right beside him. He knew when he made mistakes. And everyone else was like, Lee doesn't make mistakes. And so Longstreet, and it doesn't help that Longstreet becomes a scalawag and joins the Republican Party in the Reconstruction either. Yeah.
So my question is, why is it so difficult for some people to basically accept the actual truth of the matter? I mean, I get it, it's pride and all that, you know, gotta have our heroes, but at the same time, don't you think that it's about time that people are just like, okay, look, we lost, it happened.
Well, I would say the thing is you shouldn't say we lost. It was 150 years ago. It's like, none of us lost, none of us won.
Well,
No, they won, they lost. But I think with you, what I would say is this. The historical memory of Lost Cause is more appealing than to accept that maybe your great-great-great-grandfather who fought in Hood's Texas Brigade or something like that, Professor Castillo, whose relative did. You know, you really don't want to embrace the idea that they fought for slavery. And most of these people didn't fight for slavery. I mean, most of them are just regular, everyday guys who are like, I'm fighting because I'm told to fight, and the Yankees are coming, and I'm going to defend myself. Now, with that being said, they knew they were fighting for slavery. I mean, for example, you might not have a car at 16 years old, but guess what you want to have? still want a car if you can get one, right? You might be a poor white Southerner back then, but in the end, what would you probably like to have? You'd like to have a slave. You can get a big status symbol. It's economically valuable. But I guess I would kind of ignore your question and just do my own answer. If I make out my own question, and I would say this: most of the problems we have today on these issues, memorials and all that, is because a very large segment of the population simply refuses to accept what the historians, the actual academics who do this, say, because, well, they're a bunch of intellectual nerds and we don't listen to them. And I like this story because it's a story I want to believe. And until we can actually accept that's the actual reality of what the Civil War was and what it was about and what happened, we're stuck in a loop. We're always going to be stuck in this loop. Okay, people are going to say you can't do this to this memorial. That really doesn't mean a damn thing to me because I've never even saw it before. But it means something to me because it's valuable to me, to my culture, to my heritage, to whatever. And so until we can grow from that, we're stuck.
Why can't we just compromise?
Really? In this country?
The truth about that in the South has a better shot of a political victory than a military one, and if Lee can extend his winning streak by one in Pennsylvania, that might have a precarious political balance.
Well, potentially.
Well, I mean,
I would say this: if the Union wasn't given up after Fredericksburg, they're not giving up, because Fredericksburg was just ridiculous defeat by the Union.
then they hold on to the election 64.
Yeah. Well, what happens is, of course, then Sherman wins in Atlanta, and there's other victories, and so as a result, Lincoln is heavily reelected, and it's game over. And he was really game over by then, by 64. Yeah.
So would you say that we really can't get past this until it kind of weeds out of our culture? Because I mean, this is so in depth in the Southern culture.
Yeah, I don't see that as happening. Because it is such an important aspect of the uniqueness of Southern
I mean,
history.
look at our courthouse. We have a Confederate memorial on the lawn of our courthouse.
As a proud graduate of 1994 Robert E. Lee High School in Texas. Actually, we're going to follow up on what Tom was saying, because that is an argument that I've heard a lot about, the motivation, because when you were talking about Gettysburg, the motivations of Gettysburg, well, they were going up there because of the New York draft riots and the coming into the election and all that, and I've never bought it, but it is one of those things that gets raised that I think does, again, kind of elide the issues of slavery and everything else.
Yeah, the idea is to avoid all that.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
If you could just recommend one book, if there's one book that you're like, I wish everyone would just read this book.
On Battle of Gettysburg?
Yes.
Or
Or Robert.
well, I have a
Ford,
call
or-
from Topeka, Kansas, all those Jayhawkers. I would say that if you want about Gettysburg, right?
Yes.
Okay, Gettysburg, if you really want to get bogged down in all the details, you probably don't, this is it. Probably I would say if you want a one-volume book on the entire battle, these are considered some of the best books day by day by Harry fans. I would say a book by a guy named Stephen Sears, S-T-E-P-H-E, and Stephen Sears, like Sears Roebuck, and it's titled Gettysburg, real original. But Stephen Sears is one of the leading Civil War historians and very readable, and that's this big still, but it's a good one. That's a very readable one. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you for coming to my presentation, and thank you for coming.